Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on investigating environmental crime in Europe. My name is Nokumele Lomsweni. I'm an associate at Oxpeckers Investigative Environmental Journalism, and I'll be facilitating today's event. For the past 5 months, we've been working with the journalists from Italy, the Netherlands, and the UK to improve their skills and capacity to report on environmental crimes across the globe. Their efforts and experiences have culminated in the collection of data that was previously inaccessible and it is now available to anyone and everyone on the WildEye Europe, which is a tool that maps and tracks environmental crime across the continent. As you know, this event is hosted by Oxpeckers Investigative Environmental Journalism with the support of the Journalismfund.eu. I would like to provide you with a bit of context and background to this event. It is part of a much bigger program to address environmental crime across the globe. In 2018, Oxpeckers launched the first version of the WildEye Europe mapping tool in partnership with Earth Journalism Network. Our aim has always been to improve reporting on environmental crime and to encourage other newsrooms and journalists to do the same. Our first iteration resulted in the collection of data and hundreds of seizures, arrests, court cases, and convictions related to illegal environmental activities across Europe. We have also published dozens of data-driven investigations, shining the spotlight on a wide range of topics. Then the world turned upside down by the global health pandemic and the wildlife trafficking and its link to zoonotic diseases such as COVID-19, and that became a hot topic. We quickly saw the need to expand our work and created the WildEye project in Asia. Once again, we collected hundreds of data points across Asia. We tracked court case data over the decades and applied our innovative data journalism practices to issues that spawned in Vietnam, Malaysia, Hong Kong, the Philippines, China, Nepal, Pakistan, India, Taiwan, and Nepal. We also realized that we had started to build a community of journalists who could tap into these resources that we've created from anywhere in the world. But it remained clear that we continuously found a gap in skills where journalists struggled to combine the skills they had learned in the traditional newsrooms with the new and more creative techniques. Then there was an obvious need to tell stories in a different way. Last year, Oxpeckers developed an intensive training program that offered an ongoing support to journalists from Southern Africa with the support of USAID. I was one of the journalists who participated in the program, and for several months at a time, we learned how to collect good quality data, and our efforts led to the creation of in fact, two new tools, two new WildEye tools, one covering the Southern Africa and the other one covering East Africa. As always, these new tools collate, analyze, and they share data on criminal activities beyond borders, as well as their links to global networks. Late last year, we saw yet another opportunity to grow the WildEye program and secured support from the Journalismfund.eu. What you have been invited to today is part of the project to build the capacity of data wranglers and investigative journalists to improve their impact within a European context. For the past 5 months, we have been working with data wranglers from the region who invited to participate in the WildEye Europe training and professional support program. They will tell you a bit more about themselves later in the program, but for now, I'd like to introduce Sarah Tekat, who is originally from Germany, but is currently based in the Netherlands. Milike, who originally hails from the US and is currently living and working in the UK. Guia Baji, a data journalist based in Italy. Matteo Civilini, who splits his time between Italy and the UK. And finally, Martha Di Ferrer, a journalist working and living in the UK. One of the exciting parts of the program was that these European journalists have been mentored and guided by members of our growing community of practice based in Africa. All of our mentors for this program were either trainees in our Southern and Eastern African support programs or Oxpeckers associates that we've collaborated with from other parts of the world. We were lucky enough to have the growing journalists act as mentors and pathfinders for this program. We have Mbawa Chakula, a seasoned Malawian journalist who is a member of WildEye Southern Africa and Data Wrangling team. Sharon Atieno, a journalist based in Kenya, sorry, not in India, in Kenya, who is a member of WildEye East Africa Data Wrangling team. Sharon Liu, who is a journalist based in Hong Kong, also a member of the WildEye Asia's Investigative and a data team. And finally, Sean Global, a data journalist and techie based in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe, who is part of the WildEye Southern Africa team. For the next hour, we will be giving you an overview of an environmental crime in the region and introduce you to the WildEye Europe data journalism community. They will be sharing some of their challenges that they've encountered and how they overcame them. First, we'll hear from Milike, who used her past experiences as a lawyer to dive into using law to access environmental crime data. She worked closely with Martha Di Ferrer, another data wrangler who is based in the UK, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. They both faced a lot of pushbacks when collecting data, and Millie will now share some of those experiences and how they tried to overcome them. The floor is yours, Millie.
Thank you, Lalo. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. As Lalo said, I'm going to talk about the intersections between law and data collection. But first, just a little bit about my background. I started out as an attorney and then pivoted to work as a journalist focused on wildlife conservation. I've written articles on conservation and more recently, several books, including one on rewilding. And I also work for global conservation NGOs to help them with their communications. And I'm really passionate about conservation storytelling, essentially using stories to engage the public on matters of conservation. So today we're going to talk about the intersections between law and data collection. There are several. One involves finding data on environmental crime via legal systems. So for instance, digital court records. And then on the other hand, there's environmental crime data that's actually managed and published by non-legal entities, including WildEye. You've already seen a bit about how those systems work, but there are other similar efforts created by organizations like Legal Atlas, Traffic, and several more. And then I'm also going to talk to you about your and my legal right to actually try to secure information on environmental crime that isn't publicly available. So just for a minute, I want to talk about actually accessing data that is publicly available via legal bodies. What I've shown here are two screenshots of one website that's called Pacer in the United States. It's a way to search cases and secure information about past and existing cases involving environmental crime or any type of crime for that matter. And then there's something similar in Italy that is a database for cases that have gone through to the Supreme Court of Italy. These are great resources, but unfortunately, for several reasons, they can be really difficult to utilize. You know, unsurprisingly, governmental bodies are often limited in terms of their own resources, or sometimes these websites are not very user-friendly. It is worth mentioning that in most countries, the public is also permitted to turn up at court and sit in on cases. The problem there is that you probably wouldn't know what was actually coming off of the docket in any one day. So it's not very fruitful to just turn up to a court, let's say down the road from you in London, and hope that something comes off the docket that day involving environmental crime. That's just not a good use of your time. Fortunately, as I mentioned, there are really great organizations, including Oxpeckers, Legal Atlas, the Environmental Investigations Agency, et cetera, that provide a lot of this data for us. You've already seen how WildEye works. So you understand that you can search using things like, you know, Ivory or UK, and then you can kind of zoom in and see what kind of crime has been reported in different parts of the world. I've also shown a screenshot of the Environmental Investigation Agency's website, where you can see similar data. You can search, for instance, based on a species like rhino, and that will pull up a lot of really useful information. A lot of these resources also publish reports. So for instance, Traffic periodically publishes reports, for instance, maybe on the ivory trade. And so that will include some really interesting kind of summaries and data that you can work through. And there's things like EIA has Crime Tracker, where new crimes will periodically be published online. So these are really fantastic resources for journalists and conservationists alike. Unfortunately, as we've kind of hinted at, there are challenges involving data collection, particularly in the UK and Europe, where an individual's right to privacy is often closely guarded. Therefore, information that might be public elsewhere, like in the United States, isn't actually accessible, even though perhaps it should be. We'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So why isn't this data available? Part of it is, strapped resources and the fact that laws and systems vary by country. In the US, for instance, a lot of information about crimes is publicly available, whereas in the UK, where I live, a lot of this data is closely guarded to ensure an individual's right to privacy and an individual's right to a fair trial, both of which, of course, are very important. However, many countries grant individuals, all of us that is, the ability to request information that is otherwise unavailable using Freedom of Information or FOI requests. Over 100 countries have enacted legislation recognizing our right to make FOI requests. Typically, those are only giving us the right to make those requests to public bodies versus in the private sector. There's an EU directive granting any natural or legal person residing in or having an office in a member state to make these sorts of requests. It is worth noting that in terms of the EU, member countries have to actually graft that directive onto their legal system using legislation. So the laws in, Italy or Spain are going to vary, even though these member states are bound by the same directive. And then just going down to the more granular level, request requirements and obligations vary by entity, not just by country. When I came into this process, I somewhat naively assumed that the situation in the UK would be similar to what it is in the US, and that a lot of this data would be publicly available. And I quickly learned that in the UK, things are much more restricted. So initially, I tried to find some workarounds. There's something called the PNC, which is National Police Records, essentially. And I hoped that because of my affiliation with Oxpeckers, maybe I would be able to get access to this database. Unfortunately, that was not feasible. So then I tried making FOI requests, as did my other colleague, Marth, who's here in the UK. And unfortunately, we had very little success. Typically, we were told either that the entity we were sending a request to just didn't have the resources to respond to us, or they were able to provide certain information, like a crime occurred on such and such issue, but they were not permitted to provide an individual's name. So things were heavily redacted, and that really limited our ability to kind of drill down on what we were seeking. So I found this great website called the National Wildlife Crime Unit that publishes a lot of information about crimes happening in real time. Of course, as with these other cases, you might not find the individual's name, but you will find more information about, crime as it's taking place, or at least in sort of the last few months. And through that, I was able to gather a lot of interesting data and also find some really interesting trends. So for example, in the UK in recent years, there's been a spate of cases involving raptor persecution, which I really didn't know anything about. I guess the takeaways from all of us together are that The first thing you need to do if you are interested in gathering this sort of data is to try to do a little bit of research on what the legislation is in your country, what the FOI sort of rules and requirements are of specific organizations you want to target. You also want to think about what other interests and protections are at play. So for example, privacy laws. If you do make FOI requests, it's imperative that you are really thorough yet also narrow, because a lot of bodies will take any excuse to not reply with the information you're seeking. And just make sure you have enough time and you seek out additional avenues when possible. There's a couple of quotes here you can read if you're interested, but I guess the main takeaway is that we do have a right to gather a lot of this data, but unfortunately that right often comes up against competing rights like an individual's right to privacy. So oftentimes you won't be able to gather all of the data you want, but you will be able to find things like broad strokes overview of cases, and you'll be able to understand trends like the one I mentioned on raptor persecution. Thank you so much. That's the end of my presentation for today.
Thanks for sharing those insights, Miri. We hope that some of you joining us today will take this work forward and continue to push for access to this type of information. You can also read the blog that Martha penned down earlier this year about her experiences. It's on the Oxpeckers news page. Now we'll hand over to Sarah Tikat, who will discuss the importance of enhancing environmental journalism with data. She'll provide you with a few of her own top tips, the do's and don'ts, and the likes. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Lilo. So, hi everyone. Millie has just described all the problems that we were facing. So I think it's an important question why we're actually doing this to ourselves. And I would just quickly like to explain that. Just 2 sentences about myself. I am a freelance journalist and foreign correspondent in Amsterdam. I mostly focus on feminism, LGBTQ rights, climate issues, and social injustice. And I have become involved with Oxpeckers only earlier this year when I started to investigate the illegal timber trade from Myanmar to Europe, especially to Germany. Next slide, please. So we have seen in the global pandemic, but already before that, even that journalism has a very difficult stand. So journalists are losing trust, scientists are losing trust. So data is actually a fantastic opportunity to enhance our stories and to regain trust. Also, data helps us to recognize trends, for example, in our cases with trafficking routes, for example. But for example, when we talk about climate change and we confront people with large Excel sheets, they will probably get overwhelmed really quickly. So what we do is we create urgency with the data that we're providing. In addition to that, it can be helpful to show links and connections, for example, between different regions that we were not aware of previously. And we also support the work of scientists by giving the opportunity for public recognition. Next slide, please. How can data analysis and journalism benefit from each other? So I believe we have a win-win-win situation here, because journalists can use the data that comes from the research of scientists to actually prove and create a base of their stories. And at the same time, scientists benefit from the human touch that we as journalists give to a story. Because in the end, human beings relate to stories, to emotions, and to other human beings. So instead of just listing data and bore the audience, we are actually telling a story. So we are making this more relatable, and we kind of boil it down to just one emotional story. And I will give you an example on the next slides. So I actually believe this is a best practice example. I came across this when I was part of something that's called ComLab, organized by the International Journalist Program. And they match scientists with journalists to do exactly what I just described. So Eduardo is a scientist investigating how climate change does affect the climate at this point already, and he looks at global warming. And Lisa is a journalist from Denmark who has been working for years with the Sami people, with the indigenous people in the north of Finland. And on the next slide, you can see what came out of this. So they actually started a multimedia project about climate change, especially in the north of Finland, talking to young people of the Sami tribes, describing how climate change does already affect their daily life and their communities and their future. Next slide, please. So specific tips to my fellow journalists who are listening now. Very often when we start working, we already have the story in mind. We can admit that or not, but it's just a fact. So subconsciously, we are looking for a proof when we want to write this story. This is what you should not do with your data. Keep an open mind when you look at the numbers and the details that you get, and then really look for what the story is. Do not just look for a confirmation. You might actually miss the way bigger story in your data. And this actually happened to me as well. I will show you on the next slide what I mean by that. So my idea when I started working on wildlife trafficking to the Netherlands and to Germany, I was immediately thinking of the previous Dutch colonies in the Caribbean, Suriname and Curacao. So I was looking for that. And in my mind, it was the main hubs of Schiphol Airport, the port of Rotterdam, maybe the port of Hamburg in the north of Germany. And then it turned out this is not the story. The story is actually that from Eastern European countries, such as Czech Republic or Poland, people use land routes to traffic animals or animal products by car through the south of Germany, Bavaria, to Benelux countries, mainly the Netherlands, because Europe has open borders. Nobody checks as thoroughly as on the international airports. So this is actually my story that I never had in mind when I started. And probably a future investigation will come out of it.
Thanks for those tips, Sarah. Once again, we hope to see some of you taking this type of work forward wherever you are based. Guia Baggi, one of our Italy-based wranglers, has put her data journalism skills to good use, and in doing a deep dive analysis into the data that the group has been collecting. We will share some of the major trends and patterns that they discovered and give an overview of environmental crime across the continent. Over to you, Guia.
Thanks, Lelo. Hello, everyone. My name is Guia Baggi. I'm an independent journalist based in Italy and specializing in the environment. Lately, I've been focusing mostly on climate change impacts and solutions in the Mediterranean region. And exactly on these themes, I've recently co-founded a journalism no-profit, Magma. In a previous life, I was also among the co-founding members of IRPI, Investigative Reporting Project Italy, which I quit about 5 years ago. And I think also the picture there belongs somehow to a previous life. But anyway, I'm still very much interested in environmental crime. And that's why I'm very happy to be part of this team and inspiring project. But so let's cut to the chase. We can move exactly here. So basically, in the past few months, we put together over 167 data points. Also thanks to other organizations that shared their data with us, to mention a few, Traffic and its wildlife trade portal, the Environmental Investigation Agency, but even more. And the data we considered is mainly related to these 5 European countries. So we have Germany, Italy, United Kingdom, France, and the Netherlands. This main chart shows the number of incidents we found for each country. In the other 2 charts, you can see like the incidents per year. We focused mostly on the time frame that goes between 2018 and 2022. We have also a couple of incidents dating back to 2015, but as you can see, most of the incidents basically occurred in 2020 and 2021. Most of them, nearly half of them, are seizures, and at a lower extent, we have arrest, followed by convictions and court cases. We can move on to the next slide. Okay, so probably this reflects also the different level of publicity law enforcement agencies have in comparison with the judiciary in Europe, as a good part of this data actually comes from open access sources. So I would say that these numbers cannot be used as absolute numbers for environmental crimes in Europe. Probably there is much more out there, but the main point of WildEye is anyway to bring together everything that is available in one place. And this can already help a lot journalists find stories, looking at, as also Sarah mentioned before, at trends in the data, and also looking in this map for data for the stories. So if we can move on to the next slide. Here, I just wanted to make an example. Basically, while working on the data I have, I bumped into, I could see this trend in seizures of big cats in France. And so then I realized that actually Oxpeckers had run a story about it. And I think it's a very great example to show like a way that this kind of data can be used and this kind of tool can be used in stories. So basically, if you then have a look to this piece, it's called Tigers a la carte, you can see actually how behind this trend there is a bigger context of actually activists closely monitoring the conditions these animals were kept at circuses in France. And also there was like a debate around a new legislation on this matter. And so I also like the way the story is written and how it combines, let's say, more narrative elements with the numbers. There is actually a table summarizing arrests, seizures, court cases, and convictions in different countries in Europe, where you can actually see that France has a striking number. And also, very early in the story, there is a link that takes the reader to actually the spreadsheet that WildEye collated about all these incidents. So I thought of finishing my presentation with these examples, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks, Guya. It was great to get a bit more of the detailed insights into the state of things in Europe. And this is just a reminder that all of our data is open source and it is available on the WildEye mapping tool. Finally, we'll end things off with Matteo Civillini, who will wrap things up by sharing the group's learnings and how we plan to take things forward once the program has reached its end. Take it away, Matteo.
Hi, everyone. This is Matteo. We can move to the next slide. I'm an Italian journalist. I work between Italy and the UK. In Italy, I'm a member of IRPI, which is a Center for Investigative Journalism that Guya mentioned earlier. and I'm also a journalist at BBC World News. My areas of expertise are mainly organized crime, financial crime, but I've also looked into wildlife crime, and I came in contact with Oxpeckers for the first time in 2019 when I did an investigation into songbirds smuggling. So if we can move to the next slide, I'm gonna sum up sort of the group learnings that we have from our project in terms of the challenges in accessing data and what we've learned from it. The challenges that we faced come under two main groups. One is relates to how the data is recorded and stored by the authorities in Europe. To begin with, there is many different law enforcement agencies, ministries, and bodies that deal with wildlife crime in each European country. So there isn't a single central repository of the information, which can make it more challenging to get an overall picture. The authorities also record wildlife crime data in somewhat chaotic way. Different police departments might categorize the same crime in a different way. Wildlife crime might be described and explained by a different agency in a different way. And the other challenge that we faced is with the access to the information, as Millie explained very well earlier. Privacy laws are of primary importance in Europe, and often the balance is sort of tilted towards the individual's privacy. So it's somewhat challenging to access detailed information about individuals involved in wildlife crime. We can move to the next slide. These other things that we've learned while doing this project, the importance of leveraging the networks that we have, that we can build to get the data in other ways. So working with NGOs, working with existing databases, and thinking a bit creatively on how to overcome these challenges. Another important lesson, as Kuya was mentioning, is to be careful with the data analysis because of the lack of detailed data, or it's quite difficult to get an overall picture. So we don't have to run the risk of making assumptions or just thinking if in a specific country or a specific region there is a high number of wildlife crimes recorded. Is that because there is an actual spike in crimes there, or is it because there is more law enforcement action or data is recorded differently? So I guess the important reminder to interrogate the data and don't take it at face value. We can move to the next slide, which is about the way forward and what else we can do to continue this project and to improve data collection and analysis. We can refine and rethink the ways that we send data requests to authorities, try to understand whether it's better to go for the formal approach of the freedom of information and access requests, or whether it's best to go through more informal channels by contacting individual investigators directly or other ways. When it comes to freedom of information requests, if they are declined or delayed, as it's often the case, try to engage with the authority if they are cooperative and see how this request can be refined, and try with a different scope, a different angle. Often the requests are declined for what the authorities describe as excessive costs. So see if we can restrict the time frame or write it better. And then building on the point about the leveraging networks to get the data, cultivate and build new relationships with officials, NGOs, activists is also very important to find these other avenues to get the data. And then other simpler sort of tools that we can use to keep an eye on new data releases on the databases that we've discussed earlier, and set up Google Alerts to keep on top of the new cases. And then finally, we sort of can produce some journalism from this data that we've gathered, and we can find stories with looking at the patterns and the trends, but also we can find stories from the lack of data and trying to understand, investigate, and explain why there is a lack of data and what should be done about that. That's everything for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matteo. It's been really interesting to see how the team has pulled all of the efforts together into such a useful guide for others. We will be sharing these learnings into our Oxpeckers learning kit, which is free to access via the Oxpeckers site. Now I'd like to invite one of our mentors, Sean Globu, all the way from Zimbabwe, to say a few words about his experience on working on the WildEye. Over to you, Sean.
So my name is Sean Globu, and I am based in Zimbabwe, Bulawayo, the second largest city. My journey with WildEye started like last year, and the whole point was to, similar to what you guys have been doing in Europe, to collect certain data points and map out what was happening in Southern Africa when it came to legal trade of animals, ivory, you name it. And when I started, like most of you guys, I'm normally from a technical background, but I had an idea, but I didn't have an idea about knowledge. I had no knowledge about wildlife reporting. So for me, that was an upskill. I learned how to have a knack for wildlife reporting, and that was a plus for me. And after this exercise, I found out that, hey, I now always have an eye. I've got Google Alerts, and I'm interested in wildlife reporting. I was upskilled in a lot of things, how to data wrangle properly, how to use the tool, and also find other ways of getting information. We also have the Freedom of Information Act, where we ask for information. And I was listening to most of your presentation, of all of you, the difficulties that you went through, similar but with different contexts. We had issues with government officials didn't want to give us information, or sent to one office to another, so it's bureaucratic. So it's quite interesting that they seem to correlate some of the issues that we run to when it comes to these government entities to give us information. We're always given or sent to a brick wall or a stone wall. Also, we learned that it's important to have networks, whether it's NGOs, have people in some offices who can help you with this information, because again, this information is hard to come by. So if you work with other wildlife institutions, NGOs, or even some government entities, they could provide you with the information that you need when it came to our data wrangling. The way forward, what we saw, what we learned after almost a year with our group is that we had a group that's active. We agreed that will collaborate as a Southern Africa unit. And so in our group, there are one or two individuals who keep on sending us alerts even afterwards. So luckily afterwards, our WildEye allows us to continue reporting and sending data and information to them. So that's a plus. So after this exercise, I'm sure some of you ask, what are you going to do after getting the skill or having this information? I'm sure the team at WildEye will be very happy for you to continue sending in the information, the data wrangle, to make the map even more, the tool more interactive and have many data points. So that has been the way forward. And again, the other plus sign working with WildEye is that there have been so many opportunities that come across with me being associated with wildlife. For example, I have been able to join other or link up with other data wranglers and other wildlife reporters. There have been opportunities when it came to projects whereby there was a call for proposals or for one to be part of a data wrangling team or to be a data wrangler thanks to WildEye. So again, there are these networks that come after this exercise. So again, I think there's always life after WildEye. And again, it'd be nice as the European group for you maybe to continue data wrangling if it's something that you're interested in, always be sending alerts or even creating the map. I guess as at the end of it, that's it. It's just that it's been an interesting and fun ride for us. And I've been upskilled on how to report, how to data wrangle, and also to keep my eye out for wildlife stories. So that's been another feather on my cap. And I think that's it, Leno. I guess there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thanks so much, Sean. It's great to have you continue to join us on this journey and remain such an important part of the wildlife video practice. One of our trainers, Dr. Caroline Cox, who's a lawyer and academic and a lecturer from the UK, wasn't able to join us today, but she sent a short clip speaking to the role that she believes journalists play in combating wildlife crime across the globe. Let's hear what she had to say.
Hello, my name is Dr. Caroline Cox. I'm the senior researcher at the Ivory Project based at the University of Portsmouth in the UK. And I've been working with Oxpeckers for a couple of years now, mostly giving talks to their data journalists, and become very, very fond of the gang at Oxpeckers. I wanted to really have a brief word with you today to underline how important the work that Oxpeckers and journalists working in the environmental arena, what an amazing job they do and how important it is. So my role really as an academic is to look at particular aspects of the illegal wildlife trade in a very forensic kind of a way. But a lot of the time, academics like me have no idea of what's going on in the wider world. And that is why investigative journalists are so important. They shine a light on the really important and sometimes hidden parts of the illegal wildlife trade. Without them, without Oxpeckers, without the WildEye initiative, my job would be so much harder. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Oxpeckers and a big thank you to all the guys, all the data wranglers at WildEye for the amazing work that you do.